Hello, my name is Lisa Ross, though you may know me better as Paper Daisy Creations, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make the wildflower stitch for the Mountain Musings mystery wrap. Now, this sample right here does not have the shaping of the wrap. It is intended to show you how to work the stitch, so be sure you're following your pattern so that you have the correct shaping for the shawl. The stitches will also be a little bit different, and I've used worsted weight for this sample because I feel like it's easier for you to see the stitches, and I wanted to show you this as best as possible. Now, you may find the knitting needle part of this a little bit tricky to work. So using a crochet hook is another option, and I'm going to show you how to do it both ways. All right, now to begin, I'm going to show you what I do to carry the yarn because this stitch pattern uses two different colors, and I like to carry the yarn up the side of the wrap. And depending on what your second stitch is, it might be slightly different depending on what you're working. But this technique can work for most stitch patterns that are worked flat. All right, so what I have here, this is the back of my swatch, and you can see that I carried the yarn right up this side. And the reason I did this, so I carried it up behind the second stitch of each row. And so when you look at the side of the wrap, you don't have loops of yarn across here. So if you just carry it up with the first stitch, then you end up with little loops of yarn. Whereas if you carry it behind the second stitch, you're hiding it behind the wrap. So let me show you how I do that. So I'm going to begin working with my contrast color. In this case, it's this light blue. And I work the first stitch as normal. So for this one, it's a knit stitch. Now, my second stitch on this swatch is a knit stitch, but again, you're going to be following your pattern. So you'll probably be working it a little bit differently. Now, going into that stitch, I'm going to be knitting the light blue, but before I knit it, I'm just going to cross the main color over the blue. And then I can knit the blue. Or again, working that stitch in pattern, however your pattern calls for it. The only thing I don't recommend doing is if that second stitch is a purl stitch. This technique does not work very well for purl stitches. It ends up showing through. But as long as that is a knit stitch or an M1 or an SSK or a K2 together, all of those things work well. Before you pick up the working yarn, you just cross the other color over, and that'll trap your yarn behind your wrap. All right, so I'm going to be working my wildflower. So for this swatch, I'm going to knit 2, and now I'm going to begin my wildflower. To work this wildflower, I'm going to be looking at this second stitch on the left-hand needle. So here's the first stitch, here's the second stitch. Then I'm going to count down 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to go into this fourth stitch. And it is very easily identifiable because it is knit in the contrast color. So it's going to be that first stitch that's knit in the contrast color. So you probably won't have to do your counting each time. You'll be able to see it just fine. And I'm going to go in right above this purl stitch. So you see that purl bump right there. I'm going to go into that contrast color stitch right there, just above the purl stitch. I'm going to go into that stitch. I'm going to draw up a loop. So for me, this is how I would normally knit a stitch. And I'm going to pull that yarn through. So just like you're knitting that stitch, so whether you throw your yarn or pick your yarn, you're going to be doing it just as you would normally knit. But the difference is you're going to pull it through that middle stitch, and you make that stitch long. You're going to elongate that stitch, and what it will do is create this long petal right here for your flower. So you pull it up so that it's the same height as the other stitches, knit 2, go into that same hole, the same one that you went into before, go into that hole, yarn over and pull up a loop just like you would normally knit. And then you're going to elongate that stitch, knit 2. And now this is the hardest part of this entire stitch, is to go backwards into that hole. So I keep everything on the needles. I usually kind of hold them onto the needles. I usually use my finger to hold them in place. And you're going to go into that same hole. And I've got my finger right there so that I can just poke my finger and know exactly where I'm going. It's the same hole that the other elongated loops were pulled out of. So go into that hole, yarn over, pull up a loop, and make it nice and long. And that is the first step of my wildflower. I'm going to go ahead and knit 6. If you've knit one of my patterns before, you know that I like to help you read your knitting. And that's what I'm going to do here. We want the wildflowers to all be staggered so that each wildflower is right in between the other 2 wildflowers on the next row. And so I've got these 2 wildflowers right here down below. And if I look where they end, right here and right here, I have 5 stitches between them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want to be going into that 3rd stitch right here because that's going to make my wildflowers line up nicely. And that's I am at the correct spot because I'm going into the stitch that's below the 2nd stitch on my left needle, which happens to be the 3rd stitch in between these 2 wildflowers. I'm going to pull up a loop. I knit 2. I go into that same hole, pull up a loop. I knit 2. And here's that hard part. I go for that final elongated stitch. I'm just going to hold these stitches on my needle, go into that hole, pick up a loop, and that is my wildflower. Now, it's not going to be complete until the next row, but you can see that the base of it falls right in between these 2 wildflowers that I worked on a previous row. I knit 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I'm ready to work my next wildflower. I can't really judge it based on in between 2 wildflowers, but I can look to make sure that it goes directly above this one. As I said before, this can be a tricky stitch to work with knitting needles, and I don't want you to get frustrated with it. So if you are having trouble making the needles work, try using a crochet hook. So I've got my crochet hook. This one is, it actually doesn't really matter what size crochet hook you use. You just want to be sure that it's going to be able to go into your stitch and pull up a loop. So I'm going into this hole right here. So I look at the 2nd stitch on my left needle. I go down 1, 2, 3 into this 4th stitch. It's the contrast color stitch. I pull up the yarn like this, and I'm going to put it onto my needle like so. Now you'll see I kind of twisted it as I put it on there. It all depends on how you grab the yarn. You want to be sure that this gets positioned as it would if it was a knit stitch, and that means that the right leg of it goes in the front, and then the back leg goes in the back, the left leg of it goes in the back of your right hand needle when you put it on. So let me show you that again. I'm going to knit 2. And now my crochet hook is going to go into this same hole. It's going to scoop up a loop. And then I just want to make sure, if you see, you can kind of tug on this yarn to make sure you don't want it to be twisted, and you want the right hand leg of that stitch which is the part that's not moving. See how this is pulling the back of the leg? That's going to be positioned on the front. Now, it's not a big deal if you position your elongated loops differently. I would just suggest that you position them all the same way on your needles. So if you have them twisted, it's totally fine. I would just recommend that you always twist them if that's how you're doing it. Or if you have the left leg in front, just make sure that you always put the left leg in front. It won't be super noticeable, but for anyone who's particular about their knitting, that's what you're going to want to do. Now here is where, even if you're very good at using the knitting needles, it helps to use the crochet hook for this last one, which is the hardest of all of them to make it work. I'm going to make sure that I position it. Now I scoop the yarn a different way. So I just make sure that I position that right leg in front, because then they're all positioned the same way. I make sure it's nice and long, even with those other stitches. And now I'll work to the end. Okay, so this is what the wildflowers look like before I have done the wrong side row. All right, now I actually really love how these flowers look on the wrong side. I think they're so pretty. For this swatch, I've got garter stitch on the first 2 stitches, but I'm actually working a garter stitch ridge all the way across. I'm just going to be decreasing out those stitches that I increased for the wildflowers. So I'm going to knit my edge stitches. And now I'm going to knit 1. Okay, now here is the wildflower. If you're looking at the right side, you can see that that first elongated stitch is right here. That is the stitch you're going to knit together with the stitch that should be there. So looking at the wrong side, as you are, the elongated stitch is the first stitch on the needle, and the regular stitch, one of those knit 2, that is the second stitch on the needle. And I'm going to knit those 2 stitches together. Now these elongated stitches sometimes like to move around. They like to go on top of the other stitches, so just be sure that it's placed correctly. You can see that that elongated stitch goes behind the main color, whereas the one that was worked into the stitch has that little purl bump from the main color. So I'm going to knit these 2 together and knit 1. Here I come again to the elongated stitch is the first one, the regular stitch is the second one. That's the correct placement. I knit 2 together, knit 1. And now you'll see at the end of your wildflower, you should see this little pole right here. It sort of creates a gap until we knit it together, because this is the elongated stitch and this is the regular stitch. And because it's between the wildflower and the stitches, you have this little gap here, which is totally fine. We're just going to close it up by doing a knit 2 together. So that elongated stitch is in the right spot. Knit 2 together. And knit 5. 1. Now you can see this will be the 5th stitch that I knit, and you can see that these wildflower stitches pull themselves together. They hold themselves together. You can see this long strand coming to my next stitch. So this is the 5th stitch that I need to knit, and it marks that wildflower right here by having this gap. So these 2 are knit 2 together. Make sure they're placed correctly. Knit 1. And do that 2 more times. So I knit 2 together. Knit 1. And you can see that was tricky. This elongated stitch kind of hugged the other stitch. I don't want that to happen. I don't want to get those confused. Here's that gap because it's between the wildflowers. I close it up by doing my knit 2 together, And let me show you what it looks like on the right side. It's good to every now and then just flip to the right side and make sure everything is coming out neatly. You should have your wildflowers from 2 sections down lined up perfectly. So even though the wrap is on the bias, these flowers will still line up perfectly. And if they don't, I would imagine that your stitch count is probably off somewhere. This one falls right between the 2 that I've just finished. That's correct. These are all lined up perfectly. I'm going to keep going. So I'm going to knit 5. You can see right here, there's that gap. I'm ready to work these 2 together. So knit 2 together, K1, knit 2 together, K1, knit 2 together, and for me, I'm knitting to the end of this swatch right here. And that is how you work the wildflowers. So be sure that you're following your pattern, but hopefully this tutorial will help guide you with anything that you get stuck on. Okay, so I'm going to show you one more time how to work, how to trap the yarn along the side. So for your wrap, you're working in SSK. So I'm going to slip this stitch. When I work in SSK, I actually only slip the first stitch. I feel like it gives a neater appearance. So I'm ready to work these 2 through the back loop, just as I would for a normal SSK. But before I do that, I just cross the unused yarn over so that it gets trapped behind the main color. And that's how you're going to trap it along the sides. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you'll check out my other patterns on Ravelry or on my website, paperdaisycreations.com, and I wish you all very happy knitting.